Goodfellas is one of the greatest films ever made. This is not a controversial statement. The cinematography, the editing, the performances, all of it earns that reputation completely. But there is something the film does that almost nobody talks about, and it happens so smoothly you barely notice it while it is happening. It makes organized crime look manageable. It gives violence a rhythm and a soundtrack. It puts a camera on some of the most brutal documented events in American mob history and makes them feel like stories rather than facts. This video is about what the camera did not show. Over the next 10 sections, we are going through 10 real cases, documented through FBI records, federal court testimony, autopsies reports, and first-hand accounts from the people who were actually there. The gap between what Goodfellas put on screen and what the documented record shows is not a matter of Hollywood cutting corners. It is the difference between a film about a world and the world itself. Section 1. What really happened to Billy Bat's William Bentvena was 37 years old when he was eliminated. He had spent 6 years in a federal prison in Connecticut on a narcotics trafficking conviction. Before that, he was a full member of the Gambino crime family, a soldier who ran with John Gotti's crew in Queens. In the mob, when someone gets released from prison, people throw them a party. Food, alcohol, the works. It is a tradition. So on the night of June 11, 1970, Bentvena showed up to Robert's Lounge in Ozone Park, Queens, to a welcome home party held in his honor. The bar was owned by Jimmy Burke, a Lucchese family associate who was one of the most feared men in New York organized crime. Henry Hill, Burke's partner, was there. So was Tommy DeSimone. At some point during the night, Bentvena looked over at DeSimone and made a comment about how DeSimone used to shine shoes when he was a kid. That was it. That was the whole thing. DeSimone had actually shined shoes as a young man coming up, and Bentvena, who had known him back then, thought it was a joke. DeSimone did not take it as one. He leaned over to Hill and Burke and said he was going to eliminate Bentvena. Hill later recalled in Weezaguy his account to author Nicholas Pileggi that DeSimone was absolutely serious the moment he said it. Not drunk talk, not posturing. He meant it. 2 weeks passed. Then DeSimone followed through. Back at a bar, Burke held Bentvena down while DeSimone attacked him with his pistol, beating him across the head. The other men in the room panicked. Bentvena was a made man in the Gambino family. Removing a made man without permission from the Gambino bosses was not just a violation. It was a potential death sentence for everyone in that room. They had no sanction for this. Nobody had approved it. DeSimone had just started a war over a joke about shoes. The men stuffed Bentvena's body into the trunk of Henry Hill's car and drove north toward upstate New York to bury him on a property owned by a friend of Burke's who ran a dog kennel. Here is where the movie and reality split completely. In Goodfellas, the scene cuts to the 3 men in the car. They hear sounds from the trunk. Bentvena is still alive. The film moves quickly from there. Scorsese stages it with dark humor, the scramble, the realization, the grim improvisation. It is uncomfortable but controlled. Then it is over. Body buried. Problem solved. Next scene. What actually happened, according to Hill's account documented in Weezaguy and confirmed through the Wikipedia entry sourced directly to Pileggi's research. When DeSimone and Burke realized Bentvena was still breathing in the trunk, they stopped the car. Then they took him out and ended him with a shovel and a tire iron. Not a quick shooting. Not something clean. They beat a man to death with tools they had stopped at DeSimone's mother's house to pick up. That detail, stopping at DeSimone's mother's house on the way to finish the elimination, is one of the stranger and more mundane realities of what that night actually looked like. Bentvena was buried at the dog kennel in upstate New York. For about 3 months, that was the end of it. Then Burke's friend sold the property to housing developers. The body now had to move. Burke sent Hill and Zesimone back upstate to dig Benvina up. They exhumed the decomposed remains and drove them to a junkyard in New Jersey, owned by a man named Clyde Brooks. There, the body was fed into a mechanical compactor. William Benvina, Gambino family soldier, ended his existence crushed in a machine in a New Jersey junkyard, roughly 3 months after he was put in the ground the first time. The film does not show any of this. Not the tools, not the mother's house, not the second burial, not the compactor. The movie ends the scene at the first grave and moves on. Scorsese was not hiding these details because they were unknown. Pileggi had documented all of it in Wisegai, the same book the screenplay was based on. They were left out because they don't fit the film's rhythm. A mechanical compactor in New Jersey does not cut well to a pop song. There is one more thing the film does not address. The real reason Zesimone was eventually eliminated had almost nothing to do with Billy Batts specifically. The Gambinos did not find out Zesimone had done it for years. The secret held well into the mid-1970s. By the time the Gambinos moved on Zesimone in January 1979, the equation had grown far more complicated. Another unauthorized removal, missing Lufthansa heist money, and a girlfriend who turned out to be an FBI informant all entered the picture. The movie collapses all of that into one clean cause and one clean consequence. The reality was messier, slower, and involved a lot more people knowing a lot more things over a much longer period of time. Benvina's wife Patricia never saw him again after that June night in 1970. She was 36. The film has no wife, no family, nobody who spent decades not knowing where he ended up. The movie treats his removal as a plot device, a mistake that drives Tommy's arc toward its conclusion. The real William Benvina was a man who went to his own welcome home party and did not come back. The movie presents all of this as dangerous but glamorous. The next case shows what happened when that same glamour was stripped away entirely, and what Burke did to the men he called his closest partners the moment they became inconvenient. Section 2. The Lufthansa aftermath killings on December 11, 1978. Jimmy Burke and his crew walked out of a cargo terminal at JFK Airport with nearly $6 million in cash and jewels. It was the largest cash robbery ever pulled off on American soil at that time. The whole thing took less than an hour. No one was physically harmed during the heist itself. Burke had planned it down to the smallest detail: who stood where, who drove what, who collected which bag. For one morning, it was as close to a perfect operation as organized crime had ever seen. Within a week, Burke started removing the people who had helped him pull it off. This is the part Goodfellas turns into a montage. Set to the Rolling Stones, a series of quick cuts. Bodies in car trunks, a man in a refrigerator, another wrapped in plastic. The sequence runs for a few minutes, plays darkly funny, and moves on. The film treats the aftermath as a kind of grotesque punchline. What it does not show is the timeline, the names, or the fact that these were men Burke had worked alongside for years. Some of them were close friends. That did not matter. They had all touched the money, and Burke had decided that anyone who touched the money was a loose end. Parnell Edwards went first. His job during the heist had been to drive the getaway van to a specific location and torch it so it could not be traced. Edwards fell asleep instead. He did not destroy the van. The FBI found it and immediately had a thread to pull. 1 week after the robbery, on December 18, 1978, Tommy Zesimone and Angelo Cipe went to Edwards' apartment in Queens and ended him. He was found with 5 rounds in his head. Edwards was one of Burke's own people, someone he had trusted enough to give a role in the biggest score of his career. 1 week later, he was gone, specifically because Burke decided the mistake was unforgivable. Martin Krugman disappeared in January 1979. Krugman was the man who had originally brought the tip about the Lufthansa money to Burke through Henry Hill. Without Krugman, there is no heist. He had been promised a large cut, reportedly around $500,000, and had been pushing Burke to pay up. Burke's answer was to make Krugman vanish. His body was never recovered. Richard Eaton was found frozen inside a refrigerated trailer in January 1979. Eaton had been involved in laundering money from the heist. When Brooklyn detectives searched the body, they found a small address book sewn into the lining of his clothing. Burke's name and contact information were in it. That address book gave investigators their clearest early connection between Burke and the Lufthansa aftermath, but they still did not have enough to charge him. Thomas Monteleone, who investigators believed could have confirmed their suspicions about Eaton's elimination, was found dead in Connecticut a few weeks later. Louis Cafora and his wife Joanna disappeared in March 1979. Cafora had been assigned the job of laundering a portion of the heist money. Burke had given one explicit instruction to everyone involved: do not make any large or noticeable purchases. Cafora went out and bought a custom pink Cadillac for his wife. Burke found out. According to Henry Hill's account in Wizguy, both Louis and Joanna were taken out, and their bodies were compacted together with the car at an auto wreck yard. Neither body has ever been found. Joanna Cafora had nothing to do with the robbery. She was eliminated because her husband ignored an instruction, and Burke had decided the whole situation needed to disappear. Joe Manry and Robert McMahon were found on May 15, 1979. Both men had worked cargo operations at the airport and had helped plan earlier heists with Burke's crew. They were discovered together in a parked car, each shot in execution style. Paolo Licastri, a Gambino family representative who had participated in the heist, was found in July 1979 with his body covered in bullet wounds. By the time the aftermath settled, at least 9 people connected to the Lufthansa robbery had been removed. The FBI and NYPD investigators who descended on these cases knew almost immediately that Burke was behind them. The problem was proof. Every potential witness kept turning up dead before they could say anything. The investigation into the Lufthansa heist would drag on for years, producing limited convictions directly tied to the robbery itself. Burke was eventually convicted not for the heist or the subsequent removals, but for an unrelated scheme involving a Boston College point-shaving operation, and for the elimination of Richard Eaton specifically. He died in prison of cancer in 1996 without ever being charged for the full scope of what happened after December 11, 1978. Goodfellas frames all of this as the natural, almost inevitable consequence of the criminal world its characters inhabit. The montage moves so fast that the individuals in it barely register as people. That is exactly the problem. Parnell Edwards was a real person who fell asleep at the wrong time and paid for it 6 days later. Joanna Cafora was a real woman who had no involvement in any robbery and ended up compacted in a junkyard because her husband bought her the wrong car. The film does not have room for either of those details. The style of the sequence actively prevents them from landing. 9 people, 7 months, all of them connected to one morning at JFK Airport. Burke managed to avoid a direct conviction for any of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Goodfellas also does not show is what the men doing this work looked like up close. Not the targets, but the people carrying out the removals. The next case puts one of those men in a courtroom, under oath, describing 19 separate incidents in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that investigators and journalists who witnessed it described as one of the most unsettling things they had ever seen in a legal proceeding. Section 3. Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti. Paul Castellano was 70 years old on the night he was taken out. He was the boss of the Gambino crime family, at the time considered the most powerful organized crime organization in the United States. On December 16, 1985, he had spent the early part of his evening meeting with his attorney, James LaRasa. After that, his driver and newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bilotti, drove him across Manhattan to Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown for a dinner meeting with other family members. Castellano was a known fan of the restaurant's prime rib. He had eaten there before. He had no reason to think that night was different from any other. It was 5:16 p.m. when Bilotti pulled the black Lincolntown car up to the curb outside the restaurant. December in Midtown Manhattan means Christmas shoppers, tourists, office workers heading home. The sidewalk was not quiet. It was not a back alley or a private room. It was one of the busiest blocks in one of the busiest cities in the world, in the middle of a Monday evening during the holiday season. 4 men in matching pale trench coats and black Russian fur hats were waiting near the restaurant entrance. Gambino soldiers Vincent Artuso, Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Carniglia had been positioned there in advance. A backup team, including Dominic Spizzonia, Angelo Ruggiero, and Anthony Rampino, was stationed nearby in case anything went wrong. The whole operation had been coordinated by John Gotti, who sat in a parked car roughly half a block away alongside Sammy Gravano. Gravano had a walkie-talkie. When Castellanos' Lincoln stopped at a red light directly alongside their car, the boss of the family passing within feet of the men who had arranged his removal, Gravano radioed the hit team that the car was approaching. Castellano stepped out of the passenger side of the Lincoln. The gunman moved immediately. He was shot 6 times. 1 round entered his head. John Carniglia, according to the National Crime Syndicate's documented account of the event, delivered the fatal shot to the head. Castellano went down on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. Thomas Bilotti was 45 years old. He had been the Gambino family's underboss for exactly 2 weeks. The previous underboss, Aniello Delacroce, had died of cancers on December soon. Castellano appointed Bilotti as his replacement almost immediately, passing over several of Delacroce's own crew members who believed they were more appropriate choices. That decision, combined with Castellano not attending Delacroce's wake, accelerated the timeline of the conspiracy against him. Bilotti's promotion was one of the final triggers. When Castellano fell, Bilotti was still getting out of the driver's side of the car. According to the American Mafia history profile of Bilotti, he was unarmed that evening. He could not have defended himself, even if he had seen it coming. He was shot as he stood in the street, watching his boss go down. Gravano, in his 1992 trial testimony, described both men falling within seconds of each other. The New York Daily News Archive, covering the scene that night, reported that Bilotti's body was left in the street where rivulets of blood ran from him, while Castellano lay on the sidewalk outside the restaurant entrance. Gotti and Gravano then did something that is almost impossible to process in terms of what it says about the psychological state of the men involved. After the shooters cleared the scene, Gotti drove his car slowly past the 2 bodies. He wanted to see for himself that both men were down. Gravano was sitting next to him. They drove past a 70-year-old man and a 45-year-old man bleeding out on a public street in Midtown Manhattan and kept going. Frank DeCicco, one of the conspirators who had helped set Castellano up, was leaving the restaurant when it happened. As he walked out, he ran into Castellano's nephew, Thomas Gambino, who had also been at the dinner. DeCicco told Gambino that his uncle had just been shot and that he should go back to his car and leave. The New York Daily News archived account of this moment, drawn from Gravano's testimony, records it simply: "Go back to your car and leave." The NIPD and FBI arrived and lit the scene with portable lighting. A report went out by fax to newsrooms across the city. A single page from the NIPD noting 2 white males shot near a black Lincolntown car on East 46th Street. The identities spread quickly after that. What this event exposes that mob films consistently bury is the complete absence of privacy. This was not a basement. It was not a back room. It was a public street at rush hour in December, and two men were left on the pavement in front of Christmas shoppers while their blood ran into the gutter. There were civilians within 30 feet. The hit team wore matching outfits, trench coats, fur hats, and walked away on foot through Midtown Manhattan. Thomas Bilotti had held the second highest position in the most powerful crime family in America for 14 days. His body rested in the street on a Monday night while the city moved around it. The Castellano operation was loud, public, and carried out by a coordinated team of men acting on direct orders from above. The next case strips all of that organization away entirely and replaces it with something quieter. One man, 19 separate incidents, described under oath in a courtroom years later with the emotional range of someone reading a grocery list. Section 4. Sammy Gravano. In March 1992, Salvatore Gravano sat down in a Brooklyn federal courtroom and spent 9 days describing his involvement in 19 separate homicides. The Washington Post, covering the trial in real time, wrote that he delivered this testimony with deadpan nonchalance over 3 days of testimony about those killings alone. Time magazine described it as chilling and noted that he calmly provided what the publication called gory details while maintaining a flat, composed demeanor throughout. The courtroom observers, the journalists, the prosecutors, everyone noted the same thing. He was not performing remorse. He was not visibly disturbed. He answered questions about taking lives the way a mechanic might describe fixing cars. This is not a detail that any mob film has ever properly shown. Goodfellas presents violence as either exciting or darkly funny. Occasionally, it shows consequences. What it never shows is the version of a man who has been involved in 19 homicides and can sit in a court of law and describe each one without flinching. Because for him, that is simply what his career looked like. Gravano was born in Brooklyn in 1945 and grew up in Bensonhurst. He eventually became underboss of the Gambino crime family, the second highest position in what was at the time considered the most powerful organized crime organization in the country. He turned government witness in 1991 after hearing FBI wiretap recordings in which his boss, John Gotti, was attempting to shift blame for multiple crimes onto Gravano to save himself. Gravano pleaded guilty to a single count of racketeering. In exchange, the federal government dropped all charges related to the 19 homicides. He served 5 years. The range of people among those 19 is worth sitting with for a moment, because the films never give you the full picture. Among the victims was Nick Cibetta, who was Gravano's own wife's younger brother. Cibetta was 22 years old. He had a serious cocaine problem, had been borrowing money from loan sharks using Gravano's name without permission, and had committed several violations that embarrassed the family. The order came down from boss Paul Castellano. Gravano initially resisted. According to the Crime Library's account based on Gravano's own debriefings, he said he would take Castellano out first when he found out. Frank DeCicco, a respected senior figure in the family, sat him down and told him plainly that going to war with Castellano meant certain death. Gravano accepted the order. Cibetta was dismembered. His body was never found. The only part recovered was his hand, which authority confirmed his death from. According to the Baltimore Sun's contemporaneous 1992 trial reporting, defense lawyer Anthony Cardinale revealed during the Gotti trial, outside the jury's presence, because the judge ruled it too inflammatory, that Gravano had attended a funeral held for the hand. Gravano's wife, Deborah, did not learn of her husband's role in her brother's death until that same 1992 trial. Among the other 19 was Louis Milito, who had been Gravano's best friend and longtime criminal partner. They had worked together for years. When the order came down on Milito, Gravano attended the meeting where it happened. John Carneglia quietly came up behind Milito while he sat at a table and shot him in the head. Gravano was in the room. The Washington Post's 1992 trial coverage noted that among the 19 were men whose last names Gravano never knew. He had been all involved in their deaths without ever learning who they fully were. He served 5 years. When he was released, the federal government gave him a new identity, Jimmy Moran, and relocated him and his family to Arizona, where they set him up running a swimming pool installation business. Within months, according to multiple documented accounts including CBS News and Fox News, Gravano decided he disliked the quiet life and left the witness protection program on his own. He began giving television and magazine interviews. In 1997, he published a book with author Peter Maas titled Underboss. He also got involved in running a restaurant. By 2000, he was running an ecstasy distribution ring out of Arizona that authorities said was moving roughly 30,000 pills a week and bringing in approximately $500,000 per week at its peak. He was arrested in 2000 along with his wife, daughter, and son. He pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges in 2001 and was sentenced to 20 years. The detail that most directly exposes the gap between how mob films frame this world and what it actually produces. A 1995 psychological evaluation performed by the federal government to assess Gravano's suitability for the witness protection program found that there was a substantial likelihood he would engage in violent criminal behavior in the future, and a moderate likelihood he would engage in non-violent criminal behavior. This evaluation was conducted and documented by the same government that had just handed him a 5-year sentence for 19 homicides, and was preparing to give him a new identity and a swimming pool business in Arizona. The evaluation said he should be monitored closely. He left the program without monitoring less than a year later. Laura Garofalo, whose father Eddie was among the 19, taken out in 1990 in an operation Gravano organized, told ABC News in 2022, "People do more time for one. This is 19. She and her legal team eventually used New York state law to seize the royalties from Gravano's book, which were then distributed to families of his victims. No mob film shows the arithmetic of this. The per-incident value assigned by a plea agreement. The family of victim 19, watching the man responsible for their father's death give television interviews and write a book. The government evaluation sitting in a file somewhere that said, in plain language, that this person would almost certainly commit more crimes. And then the decision to release him anyway because his testimony was worth more than any of that. What Goodfellas presents as a glamorous and dangerous world of loyalty and consequence was, for 19 families, a bureaucratic transaction in which the man who organized their losses walked out of a courthouse in 5 years and started a podcast. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case goes further in a different direction entirely. Not to a courtroom or a courthouse, but to a suburban New Jersey home, a family dinner table, and a man who spent more than 2 decades carrying out contract work for multiple crime families, while his wife and 3 children had no idea what he did for a living. Section 5. Richard Kuklinski. Richard Kuklinski lived on Sunset Street in Dumont, New Jersey, with his wife, Barbara, and their 3 children. The neighbors knew him as a big, friendly man who hosted barbecues by the pool in the backyard. The family took trips to Disneyland. The children attended private schools. Barbara described her husband to people as a wholesale distributor. He employed an accountant. On Sundays, he ushered at the local Catholic church. Between those Sunday mornings and the backyard barbecues, Kuklinski was carrying out contract work for the Genovese, Gambino, and De Cavalcante crime families. The number of people he took out over the course of his career is disputed, but law enforcement investigators and Britannica both document that he was convicted of 5 murders in 1988, later pled guilty to a 5th in 2003, and in a series of recorded prison interviews, confessed to at least 100 more. He carried out assignments using firearms, cyanide, strangulation, blunt force, and on at least one documented occasion, he left a living victim to be consumed by rats. He froze bodies in industrial freezers after the fact, sometimes for years, specifically to confuse medical examiners on the time of passage. That last method gave him his nickname, the Iceman. Goodfellas presents its characters as men who exist in a clearly defined criminal world, one where the violence is visible, the tensions are on the surface, and the lifestyle is recognizable as criminal, even when it looks glamorous. Richard Kuklinski was the direct opposite of that. He moved between 2 completely separate realities, and the wall between them held for 25 years. His connection to organized crime began through pornographic film bootlegging, which brought him into contact with mob figures in the New York area. He eventually auditioned for contract work with Roy DeMeo of the Gambino family. According to Kuklinski's own account, documented across his HBO interviews and the Britannica entry on his life, the audition consisted of DeMeo driving him past a park, pointing at a man walking his dog, and telling Kuklinski to take him out. Kuklinski got out of the car, approached the man from behind, fired a single round into the back of his head, and returned to the car. He was hired. The methods he developed over the years were chosen specifically to avoid detection. Cyanide was a favorite because it could be administered through food, through direct skin contact, through injection, or through aerosol spray. It produced symptoms that could be misread by medical examiners as cardiac failure. Kuklinski learned cyanide techniques from a man he worked with named Robert Pronge, known as Mr. Softy, who drove an ice cream truck. In 1984, Pronge was found shot in his truck. Investigators believe Kuklinski was responsible, though no one was ever charged. The 5 murders Kuklinski was ultimately convicted for followed a specific pattern. George Malaband was taken out in 1980 after a meeting that was supposed to be a videotape business deal. Louis Masgay, also involved in a proposed videotape deal, was last seen in 1981. His body surfaced 15 months later in a partially decomposed state, and the medical examiner found ice crystals in the tissue. The first indication that a body had been stored frozen before being disposed of. Gary Smith, a member of a burglary ring Kuklinski ran, was given cyanide and then strangled in 1982. His body was found under a bed in a motel room. Daniel Deppner, another member of the same ring, was found the following year, also poisoned. Paul Hoffman, who disappeared in 1982 after trying to purchase prescription drugs from Kuklinski, was never found at all. The investigation that brought him down ran for 6 years. New Jersey State Police Detective Pat Kane began the case, which eventually became a joint operation between the New Jersey Attorney General's Office, the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The ATF assigned undercover agent Dominic Polifrone to the case. Polifrone posed as a career criminal named Dominic Provenzano, who was looking for a reliable contract worker. He first made contact with Kuklinski at a Dunkin' Donuts near Kuklinski's home in Dumont, wearing a wire under his jacket. Over the next 18 months, Polifrone met with Kuklinski repeatedly, at parks, at highway service stations, at various locations around New Jersey. He recorded Kuklinski openly describing his methods and past work in significant detail. At one point in the recorded conversations, documented in the criminal behaviors analysis of the case, Polifrone asked Kuklinski why he preferred cyanide over a firearm. Kuklinski replied, Why be messy? You do it, nice and calm. By late 1986, Polyphrone had arranged a stage transaction. He would supply Kuklinski with fake cyanide capsules, and Kuklinski would supply him with a firearm fitted with a silencer. On December 17, 1986, they met at a truck stop off the New Jersey Turnpike. Polyphrone handed over a briefcase containing the fake cyanide. Kuklinski opened it, inspected the contents, and handed over the silenced weapon wrapped in newspaper. Polyphrone gave the signal. Agents from the Attorney General's office and the ATF moved in and arrested Kuklinski without resistance. When they searched his car and home, they found weapons, ammunition, photographs of victims, and the recorded tapes of his conversations with Polyphrone. In March 1988, a jury found him guilty of 5 counts of homicide. He was sentenced to consecutive life terms, making him ineligible for parole until the age of 110. From prison, Kuklinski gave extensive interviews to psychiatrists, journalists, and documentary filmmakers, including the HBO documentary The Iceman Tapes in 1992. In those interviews, he said he had never felt sorry for anything he had done, other than the impact on his family. He said he wanted his family to forgive him. Barbara Kuklinski told reporters after his arrest that when the detectives explained what her husband was charged with, something shifted. She said it was like suddenly everything made sense. She said she had always known, on some level, that he was capable of it. She had spent 25 years raising 3 children with him in suburban New Jersey, going to church on Sundays, attending neighborhood barbecues, and she had never said a word to anyone. Whether that was because she genuinely did not know, or because she knew well enough and understood what saying something would cost her, is something only she can answer. The next case moves from the contained double life of one man to the opposite end of the spectrum entirely. A room full of approximately 15 people, 2 brothers who walked in believing one thing, and what the forensic pathologist who examined their bodies afterward said about how they actually died. Section 6. Anthony and Michael Spilotro. On the morning of June 14, 1986, Michael Spilotro told his wife Anne that if he and his brother were not back by 9 o'clock that night, something very wrong had happened. According to trial testimony from the 2007 Family Secrets federal case in Chicago, Michael's daughter, Michelle, told the court that her father had told her he loved her at least 10 times before leaving the house that afternoon. Both brothers removed all of their valuables and personal identification before they got in the car. They knew something was off. They got in the car anyway. Anthony Spilotro, 48, was the Chicago outfit's man in Las Vegas. He had overseen the organization's casino interests in Nevada through the 1970s and into the 1980s. The FBI estimated he was connected to nearly 24 homicides across Nevada and Illinois over the course of his career. By 1986, he had worn out his welcome with outfit leadership for a combination of reasons: his loud, insubordinate behavior, the heat he was drawing from federal prosecutors across multiple open cases, and what the Wednesday Journal's coverage of the Family Secrets trial described as his apparent relationship with the wife of a mob associate. The bosses had decided he needed to be removed. An earlier plan to take him out in Las Vegas using explosives and automatic weapons had been abandoned. What replaced it was simpler and required no weapons at all. Michael Spilotro, 41, was his younger brother. He owned a restaurant in Chicago called Hoagie's. He was an outfit associate, not a full member. The lure used to get both brothers to the meeting was a promise of advancement. Anthony would receive recognition for his service, and Michael would be formally inducted as a full member of the Chicago outfit. The ceremony for becoming a made member was something Michael had been working toward. They drove from Michael's Oak Park townhouse in his 1986 Lincoln Continental to meet Mob Lieutenant James Marcello at a motel parking lot in Schiller Park. Marcello then drove them to the location in Bensonville, a suburb adjacent to O'Hare International Airport. According to Nick Calabrese's testimony at the family secrets trial, Calabrese being the first made member of the Chicago outfit to ever become a government witness. The brothers were brought into the basement of a house. Waiting there were approximately 10 to 11 men, documented in trial records as including James LaPietra, John Feccarata, John DiFronzo, Sam Sarlisi, Louis Aboli, James Marcello, Luis Marino, Joseph Ferriola, Ernest Infelice, and Calabrese himself. When the brothers entered the basement, the men moved on them immediately. Calabrese testified that he tackled Michael Spilotro and held his legs while another man strangled Michael with a rope. He said he heard Anthony Spilotro ask if he could say a prayer. There was no reply. The beating continued until both men were dead. The movie Casino, released in 1995, depicted this scene with baseball bats in a cornfield, the two brothers buried alive in the dirt. That version has been repeated so many times in popular culture that most people who know the Spilotro story believe it. Forensic pathologist Dr. John Pless, who testified at the family secrets trial and who had participated in the original autopsies of both men in 1986, stated under oath that there was no forensic evidence the brothers had been beaten with bats and no evidence they were alive when they were buried. He told the court that the injuries to both men, blunt trauma to the head, neck, and chest, were most consistent with bare fists, knees, and feet. The brothers died partly from direct physical trauma and partly because, in Pless's documented trial testimony, their lungs and airways had filled with so much blood from the wounds that they could no longer draw breath. The bruising on the backs of both men's hands, Pless testified, indicated they had tried to shield themselves from the blows. After the brothers were dead, their bodies were driven to a cornfield near the small town of Enos in Newton County, Indiana, roughly 60 miles outside of Chicago. They were buried one on top of the other, stripped down to their undershorts, in a grave approximately 5 feet deep. John Feccarata and others handled the transportation and burial. The grave was supposed to be permanent. It was not. On June 22, 1986, 8 days after the brothers disappeared, a farmer named Mike Kintz from nearby Moments, Illinois, was plowing his cornfield. He noticed a patch where no corn was growing. He investigated because he thought someone might have buried a deer killed out of season. What he found, according to the UPI contemporaneous report from June 23, 1986, were the badly battered bodies of Anthony and Michael Spilotro, stacked in the shallow grave. The Chicago Archdiocese ruled the following day that the brothers could not receive a Catholic funeral at their family church, St. Bernardine in Forest Park, because of their organized crime ties. A private service was held in a cemetery chapel at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside on June 27. 3 of the men who had been present in that Bensonville basement, Ferriola, Infelice, and Marino, attended the wake the day before the burial. John Feccarata, who had driven the bodies to Indiana, and whose job was to ensure no evidence remained linking the burial to the outfit, made a mistake at the scene and left behind a bloody glove. Years later, DNA from that glove gave the FBI the evidence needed to pressure Nick Calabrese into cooperating. Feccarata was taken out 2 weeks after the Spilotros, on September 14, 1986, by Calabrese and Frank Calabrese Sr., specifically because he had botched the burial job. James Marcello, who drove the brothers to the house and was documented in Operation Family Secrets records as the man who led them down to the basement, was convicted at the Family Secrets trial in 2007 and sentenced to life in prison. What happened in that basement involved no guns, no cinematic drama, and no cornfield. It was roughly a dozen men in a suburban house waiting for 2 others to walk through a door. The brothers knew enough to be afraid before they arrived. They came anyway, because refusing was not a real option. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next moves entirely away from the face-to-face violence of these earlier cases and into something colder. A man who carried out work across decades with such ordinary composure that his colleagues in Boston, even after learning what he had done, described him to reporters as remarkably likable. Section 7. John Martirano. John Martirano was born in Somerville, Massachusetts on December 13, 1940. He was a one-time altar boy. He named his youngest son James Stephen, after his two closest friends and criminal associates, James Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi. He committed his first confirmed act of lethal violence in 1965 and his last in 1982. In between, over 17 years, he was involved in 20 homicides carried out across multiple states. He served 12 years in prison for all of it. Then the federal government gave him $20,000 to help him start over. In June 2013, Martirano sat in a federal courtroom in Boston and testified at the racketeering trial of Whitey Bulger. CBS News, covering the trial in real time, reported that he gave short, matter-of-fact answers when questioned about the string of people he had taken out while working as an enforcer for the Winter Hill Gang. Multiple outlets covering the trial noted the same quality to his testimony: calm, flat, unemotional. The Boston Globe described him as cool. Fox News described his demeanor as matter-of-fact throughout his description of grisly details. When prosecutors asked him about specific victims, Johnny Jackson, Tony Varanis, Robert Palladino, his answer for each was the same three words: "I shot him." The only moment anyone in the courtroom recorded as showing visible feeling came when Martirano was asked about learning that Bulger and Flemmi had been FBI informants the entire time they worked together. He said it broke his heart. They were his partners in crime, his best friends, his children's godfathers. 20 people gone, and what cracked his composure was finding out his bosses had been talking to the FBI. The 20 people he admitted to taking out covered an extraordinary range of circumstances, locations, and reasoning. Some were ordered by Bulger and Flemmi. Some were decisions Martirano made himself within the logic of the criminal world he operated in. At least one was a straightforward case of getting the wrong person entirely. On March 8, 1973, Martirano was trying to take out a man named Al Notahangeli, a rival gang figure. He opened fire on a car in Brighton, Massachusetts, using a machine gun. The driver was not Notahangeli. His name was Michael Milano. He had simply been driving the same type of car as the intended target. Milano was killed. 2 other people in the vehicle were wounded, one of whom, Louis Lapiana, was left paralyzed for life. Martirano testified about this incident at the Bulger trial. He was not charged separately for Milano's death as part of his plea agreement. In January 1968, in a single incident in Dorchester, Martirano took out 3 people: Hubert Smith, Elizabeth Dixon, and a 17-year-old named Douglas Barrett. After what he described as a dispute involving Flemmi, in which he felt he had not been shown sufficient respect, all 3 were in the same parked car. The killing of Roger Wheeler on May 27, 1981, is documented in particular detail because it was carried out in broad daylight at one of the most socially visible locations possible. Wheeler was 55 years old, the chairman of Telex Corporation and owner of a Florida Jai Alai business. Martirano testified that he spent 4 days in Tulsa, Oklahoma, following Wheeler's movements and learning his routine. Wheeler had a regular Wednesday afternoon tea time at Southern Hills Country Club. That Wednesday, Martirano waited in the parking lot. Wheeler finished his round, showered, and walked to his black Cadillac near the club's swimming pool. As Wheeler sat in the driver's seat, Martirano walked up to the window and shot him in the face at close range with a .38 caliber revolver. The autopsy report, referenced in Washington Times coverage of the case, noted that the barrel of the weapon was so close that it left no powder burns on Wheeler's face, but shattered his eyeglasses and embedded fragments in his eyes. Wheeler had $996 in cash and 8 credit cards in his suit pocket and an expensive watch on his wrist. None of it was touched. The reason Wheeler was taken out: Callahan, a Bulger associate, had been skimming profits from the Jai Alai business. Wheeler owned and wanted Wheeler removed so his wife would sell the company. Martorano received information about Wheeler's daily schedule from former FBI agent Paul Rico, who was also later charged in connection with the case. John Callahan himself was taken out the following year on July 31, 1982, in Miami. The FBI, through corrupt agent John Connolly, had tipped off Bulger that Callahan was likely to implicate the Winter Hill Gang in the Wheeler case under federal pressure. Martorano and an associate met Callahan in a van in Florida. Martorano shot him with a weapon wrapped in a towel. Callahan's body was left in the trunk of his silver Cadillac at Miami International Airport, where it was found days later. Scattered items from Callahan's belongings were left around Little Havana to make the scene appear connected to a drug transaction. John Connolly, the FBI agent who passed along the information that led to Callahan's death, was eventually convicted of second-degree murder in 2008 and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Martorano's plea agreement, finalized in 1999 after his arrest in Boca Raton, Florida, where he had been living under an assumed name for 16 years, covered 20 homicides and required him to testify against Bulger, Flemmi, Connolly, and others. He served 12 years. The federal government gave him $20,000 upon release, and he sold his story to a film company for $250,000. He declined witness protection and returned to Boston. A colleague of journalist Howie Carr, who later co-wrote a book with Martorano, commented after meeting him that he was, quote, damned likable. David Wheeler, son of the Oklahoma businessman Roger Wheeler, addressed Bulger in court during sentencing in November 2013. He said the greatest shame of all fell on the FBI for the corruption that had enabled everything Martorano and Bulger had done. The next section moves to a case that was institutional in a completely different way. Not a street gang, not a family, but a sanctioned operation approved by the bosses of multiple New York crime families, carried out in a restaurant garden on a hot July afternoon while the victim sat eating lunch with his cigar in his mouth. Section 8. Carmine Galante. Carmine Galante was 69 years old on July 12, 1979. He had spent the morning doing whatever a man does on a hot Thursday in Brooklyn in the middle of summer. By early afternoon, he was at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in the Bushwick neighborhood, eating lunch with his cousin. The restaurant's owner, Giuseppe Turano, was that cousin, a soldier in the Bonanno crime family. Also at the table was Leonard Coppola, a Bonanno captain and a long-standing ally of Galante's. 2 bodyguards, Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato, sat with them. The group ate outside on the patio, in the sun, with wine on the table. At 2:45 in the afternoon, 3 men in ski masks walked into the restaurant and headed straight to the patio. What happened in the next few seconds is documented in federal court records from the 1986 Mafia Commission trial and the subsequent appeal. According to testimony and evidence presented in that case, Galante was hit by a shotgun blast to the chest and a bullet through his left eye. He died in his chair. Giuseppe Turanos, his cousin, and the man who owned the restaurant where he was eating was shot in the head and died. Leonard Coppola was also shot in the head and died. The shooting was over in moments. Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato, Galante's 2 bodyguards, were completely unharmed. That detail is not incidental, it is the entire story. According to the Mob Museum's detailed account of the assassination and the federal court records from the commission trial, Bonanno family boss Philip Rastelli had needed to get approval for the Galante operation from multiple parties, including Galante's own inner circle of Sicilian associates, specifically Bonvant and Amato. The two bodyguards were offered promotion and a larger share of the family's narcotics operation if they cooperated. According to federal evidence presented at trial, they did not hesitate. They helped set their own boss up for the operation. They brought him to that restaurant. They sat at that table. When the men in ski masks came through the door, Bonventre and Amato moved out of the way. The planning for the Galante operation had been underway since at least May or June of 1979. Federal court documents from the United States v. Indelicato case, decided by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in 1989, establish that the Mafia Commission, the governing body overseeing the 5 New York families, planned and implemented the operation as part of a coordinated effort to end internal conflict within the Bonanno family and remove Galante's grip on the heroin trade. The commission worked through Aniello Della Croce, underboss of the Gambino family, and Stefano Canone, the Bonanno family's consigliere. One of the shooters, Anthony Indelicato, had been recruited into the operation by Dominic Trinchera, who had introduced Intro to another participant and asked him whether he had previous experience with this kind of work. The getaway car was stolen. After the shooting, the team fled in it and abandoned it. Anthony Indelicato made a critical error in that car. He touched the door handle. In mid-1980, FBI investigators matched his palm print to the handle of the abandoned vehicle. That physical evidence, combined with surveillance footage the FBI had captured, was enough to charge him and eventually present the case at the commission trial. The surveillance footage was particularly damaging. FBI agents had been watching a Manhattan social club that served as the headquarters of Gambino underboss Aniello Della Croce. Their footage captured Anthony Indelicato arriving at that location approximately 30 minutes after Galante, Turano, and Coppola had been taken out in Brooklyn. The footage showed Indelicato being congratulated by Bonanno family consigliere Stefano Canone. It also showed him meeting with Della Croce, the underboss of a separate crime family, to report on what had just happened. This evidence was presented to the jury at the commission trial. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals, in its 1989 ruling on the case, confirmed that the footage and the palm print established commission-level involvement in the operation. At the commission trial in 1986, Indelicato was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was released on parole in 1998. He was back in prison by 2001 for his role in a separate Bonanno family operation. Baldo Amato, one of the 2 bodyguards who stepped aside when the shooters entered, was sentenced to life in prison in 2006 for 2 unrelated homicides in 1992. The photograph of Galante's body, taken immediately after the shooting, was published on the front page of the New York Post and newspapers around the world. He was in his chair, slumped back, with the cigar still clenched between his teeth. It became one of the most widely reproduced crime scene images in American history. What this case documents, in a way that no mob film has ever properly shown, is the institutional machinery behind a high-level operation. This was not one person making a decision and giving an order. The commission had sanctioned it. The Gambino underboss had helped coordinate it. The target's own bodyguards had agreed to it. A recruited participant had been vetted for prior experience. A stolen getaway vehicle had been prepared. And within 30 minutes of the operation concluding, the shooter was at a social club in Manhattan being formally congratulated by senior figures from 2 separate crime families. All of that infrastructure, the approval process, the betrayal by the protective detail, the post-operation debrief, is what mob films replace with dramatic music and a quick cut. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case in this series does not involve a single operation, a single family, or even a single decade. It involves an entire organization that ran for nearly 10 years, carried out an estimated 400 to 1,000 contract operations, and was dismantled entirely by one man who decided that dying in the electric chair was not something he wanted to do. Section 9, Murder Inc. The organization that the press named Murder Inc. did not have a headquarters anyone would recognize from a mob film. It operated out of a candy store on Saratoga Avenue in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, owned by a woman named Midnight Rose. Open all night, it served as a meeting point, a message drop, and an informal office for a collection of Jewish and Italian contract workers who spent the 1930s fulfilling elimination contracts on behalf of the National Crime Syndicate, the governing body that oversaw organized crime across the entire country. Any mob boss anywhere in America could place a request. Murder Inc. would send a team of strangers to handle it, collect a fee, and return to Brooklyn. The key feature of the operation was distance. The victims never knew their attackers, which meant there were almost no witnesses and almost no forensic connections to trace back to the men who had placed the contracts. For roughly a decade, this arrangement functioned with almost total impunity. The organization was overseen by Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia, who served as its operating head. The core crew was based in Brownsville and the neighboring Ocean Hill section of Brooklyn. Its primary members included Abe Reyes, Harry Strauss, Harry Maione, Frank Abandando, Martin Goldstein, Luis Capone, and Ali Tannenbaum. They were not glamorous figures operating out of restaurants and clubs. They were working-class men from Brooklyn who accepted contracts the way a tradesman accepts jobs. Methodically, professionally, and without significant emotional involvement in the outcome. Harry Strauss, known as Pittsburgh Phil, was the most prolific among them. He had been arrested 7 times in New York City alone by 1934 on charges of homicide, assault, and other offenses, and had never been convicted of a single crime. His method of operation, documented across multiple sources, including the Brooklyn District Attorney's prosecution files and the J. Grit Historical Archive, was to travel to wherever the contract required, locate an appropriate tool at the scene, rather than carry a weapon across state lines, complete the work, and return home. He packed a briefcase with a change of clothes. According to court records and reporting from the 1940 prosecution, when he went out of town for a job, he often did not even know the name of the person he was sent to deal with, and generally did not ask. The Brooklyn DA's office was able to develop solid evidence tying him to 28 confirmed incidents when the investigation broke open in 1940. Law enforcement in other states came up with a similar number in which he had been positively identified. His documented methods included shooting, ice pick stabbing, strangulation, drowning, and live burial. An ice pick inserted properly into the ear canal, according to court testimony from the era cited in the Crime Library archive, could produce brain damage that medical examiners would sometimes record as a cerebral hemorrhage, classifying the death as natural causes. When he and 2 associates dealt with Irving Feinstein in September 1939, they used both an ice pick and a rope at Relez's own house, then dumped the body in a vacant lot and set it on fire. That killing became one of the central cases in the Murder Inc. prosecution. When Walter Sage, a mob associate who had been skimming from slot machine profits, was marked for removal, Strauss and his crew dealt with him during a car ride using an ice pick. They then drove the body to the shore of a lake and tied it to a pinball machine, a reference to the slot machines Sage had been stealing from, before dumping both into the water. The entire organization came apart because of one arrest in early 1940. Two low-level associates, Anthony Mafia and Abe Levine, were picked up first and agreed to talk. Their cooperation led investigators to Release. By March 1940, Abe Reles was sitting in a cell at the Tombs Jail in Manhattan, facing 8 murder charges, staring at the electric chair. He wrote a letter to his wife asking her to approach the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office about a deal. Reles had what prosecutors needed above everything else: a photographic memory and direct knowledge of roughly a decade of contracts. According to the Mob Museum's documented account of his cooperation, his testimony helped the Brooklyn DA's office close the books on 85 confirmed organized crime incidents in Brooklyn alone. He testified in California and in Newark. His detailed information on the structure of the syndicate and its connection to regional crime operations gave federal and state prosecutors a map of American organized crime that had not previously existed. On the basis of his testimony and that of other cooperating members, 7 men went to the electric chair at Sing Sing. Among them was Strauss, who attempted to avoid execution by growing his beard out, refusing to bathe, and feigning insanity during his trial, chewing continuously on a leather strap from a briefcase. The jury was not persuaded. Strauss was executed on June 12, 1941. Lepke Buchalter was executed in 1944, becoming the only senior-level American mob boss ever to receive the death penalty through the legal system. Reles never saw any of that. On the morning of November 12, 1941, he was found on a roof extension 6 floors below his guarded room at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where he had been kept in protective custody by the NIPD. He was scheduled to testify that same day against Albert Anastasia in a murder case. Anastasia had previously survived the electric chair once through mob intervention and had no intention of facing it again. The Mafia Commission had placed a bounty of $100,000 on Reles. 18 officers had been assigned to guard him in rotating shifts. According to both Lucky Luciano and mob informant Joe Valachi, as documented in multiple published accounts including the Crime Magazine archive, Reles was thrown from the window while unconscious, and the NIPD captain overseeing the guard detail was involved. The case was never solved. The official cause of death remains undetermined. Assistant DA Burton Turkus, who prosecuted the Murder Inc. cases and sent 7 men to the chair, stated categorically in his later writing that Reles was thrown out of that window. He wrote that he never knew who did it, but that he had no doubt it was not an accident. The final case in this series returns to where we started. A Brooklyn bar, a man who came home from prison expecting to celebrate, and a night that ended with the question of what actually happened to the person at the center of it all, and what the men who were supposed to be protecting him were willing to do when the alternative was accountability. Section 10. Thomas DeSimone. Thomas DeSimone was 32 years old when he disappeared on January 14, 1979. He had spent the years since the Lufthansa heist the previous December, apparently believing that the Gambino family was in the process of making him a formal member. Giving him his button, as the process is called. Being made was the thing DeSimone had wanted his entire criminal life. He was an associate of the Lucchese family, which meant he was useful but structurally outside. Full membership was status, protection, recognition. It was the one thing his career had been moving toward. On that January morning, he put on his best clothes. According to accounts documented across multiple sources including Historica Wiki and the detailed riddles. Next profile of DeSimone's life, he said goodbye to his mother before getting in the car with 2 Lucchese family members, Tuddy Cicero and Bruno Facciolo, who told him they were driving him to the induction ceremony. When they arrived at the house, it was empty. No other family members, no ceremony. just a vacant building. By then, he understood what was happening. His recorded last words, according to multiple documented accounts, were, "Oh no." Cicero fired one round into the back of his head. His body has never been found. He was declared legally dead in 1990. His wife, Angela, known as Cookie, reported him missing on January 14, 1979, telling police she had last seen him a few weeks earlier when he stopped by to borrow $60. Goodfellas shows Tommy DeVito walking into a room expecting to be made, receiving a quick shot to the back of the head, falling to the floor, and dying. The camera shows his body. The film gives his death the dignity of a conclusion. The real version has none of that. There is no grave, no body, no confirmed resting place. According to Henry Hill's account in Visagai, documented in Nicholas Pileggi's book and the Den of Geek analysis of the case. The day after DeSimone went missing, Hill watched Jimmy Burke take a phone call in a booth and then slam the receiver down so hard the whole booth shook. Burke was crying. Hill wrote that Burke said they had taken Tommy out. The Gotti crew. Just that. Then nothing. The film also states in a closing title card that Tommy was shot in the face so his mother could not have an open casket funeral. The shortlist's documented fact check of Goodfellas and multiple other sources confirm this detail was invented for the film. Because there was no body, there was no funeral of any kind. His mother had nothing to bury. The real reasons DeSimone was taken out are more complicated than the movie presents. Goodfellas frames it as a clean, singular cause: the unauthorized removal of Billy Batts in 1970, which violated Gambino family protocol and had to be answered. That is part of it. But by January 1979, the full picture had accumulated considerably more weight. DeSimone had also taken out Ronald Jaroth in 1974, who was a young associate connected to John Gotti, again without permission from anyone. His girlfriend at the time, Teresa Ferrara, was working as an FBI informant. A fact documented in multiple sources covering the Lufthansa investigation, and DeSimone, as someone close to her, would have had both access to that information and to the missing Lufthansa money that investigators were trying to account for. His brother Anthony was also killed in 1979, taken out by Gambino associate Thomas Agro for a separate but related reason. Anthony had been talking to law enforcement. The DeSimone name had become a problem on multiple fronts simultaneously. Two different accounts of who specifically carried out the act on DeSimone have circulated in the years since. Henry Hill told investigators and later wrote in his memoir that John Gotti personally fired 3 rounds into DeSimone's head. A separate account attributed to mob informants Thomas Agro claims Agro himself did it, with Gotti present. No single account has been officially confirmed. What is confirmed? DeSimone's remains have never been recovered. Investigators and former associates have theorized he was buried somewhere in what law enforcement has informally called an organized crime burial ground on the Brooklyn-Queens border near Kennedy Airport, an area from which bodies connected to various organized crime figures were recovered in 2004. That theory has never been verified. Teresa Ferrara, DeSimone's girlfriend, was taken out shortly after he disappeared. According to Den of Geek's documented account of the case, she left her beauty shop in Belmore, Long Island on February 10, 1979, after an anonymous caller asked her to meet someone at a nearby diner. She told her niece that if she was not back within 15 minutes, her niece should come find her. She did not come back. Her body was found later, dismembered. DeSimone was born on June 6, 1946. His Wikipedia entry, sourced to court records and FBI files, lists his status as missing for 47 years, 2 months, and 21 days. There is no death date because there is no confirmed date of death. There is no burial date because there is no confirmed location. The legal declaration of death in 1990 was a bureaucratic determination. not a finding of a body. Goodfellas is one of the most technically accomplished films ever made about this world. Its camera work, its editing, its performances are all exceptional. But the world it depicts is consistently cleaner, faster, and more narratively satisfying than the documented record of what actually happened to the real people it is based on. DeSimone did not die cleanly in front of a camera. He got in a car on a January morning, put on his best clothes, said goodbye to his mother, and then ceased to exist. No one who has since looked for what remains of him has found anything to bury. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.